Okay, hello chess players. Today we're going to be going over the Ruy Lopez after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and no, we're not going to be covering the Berlin, which will probably account for about half of your Ruy Lopez games. Instead, after a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, we are also not going to be going over the Marshall, which will account for almost the other half of your chess games. What we're going to be going over is one of the old main lines that begins with d6, pawn to c3, castles, and then h3, and we're reaching this old mainline position where there were basically a half dozen or more different moves that black could make, and then of course on the next move there were a half dozen moves after that, which just started this giant mountain of Ruy Lopez theory that everybody had to know, and this video is on one of those lines, because of course I can't cover all of them. The video would be 3 days long. It's going to be the Kholmov variation, beginning with the move bishop e6. Well, anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So the Kholmov variation is just like almost any other line beginning here, which is white's just going to have a slight edge because as soon as white plays d4, white's going to have the pawn duo in the middle of the board. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. We need to know sort of what's going on, how the basic piece deployment happens, what the basic plans are in the position, because of course every different move order here is kind of unique, and every way that white can respond to it is a little bit different. So bishop e6 is the Kholmov variation, and white's correct reply should just be to play d4 and immediately threaten that move pawn to d5, immediately get that pawn duo in the middle of the board. This sort of forces black's reply. Black has to play bishop captures b3 just to avoid the fork. And then here, white should capture back with the a pawn to bring that pawn closer to the middle of the board, also open his rook file, and also keep the queen on the d file, protecting that d pawn and preparing to do things like push, etc. It is possible to play queen b3, but a b3 is a little bit stronger. So a captures b3, and then we're going to have e captures d4, and then we're going to have c captures d4. Now in this position, white has this threat of pawn to d5, so usually black will play pawn to d5 himself. It is not forced. If black plays another move, for example knight to b4, white should reply with pawn to d5. And that's exactly what happened in Gelfand versus Mikkelsen, played in Istanbul, Turkey back in 2000. And that game continued pawn to c5, d captures c6, pawn to d5, because again, we have to get this move in somehow, some way. Pawn to e5, knight to e4, knight to c3, knight c3, bc3, knight c6, queen to d3, queen d7, rook a2, queen e6, bishop g5, developing that last piece, rook fd8, bishop captures bishop, queen captures, and then rook on a to e2 was major advantage white for Gelfand, and Gelfand did go on to win, and Gelfand versus Mikkelsen played back in Istanbul, Turkey back in 2000. So if we go back to this critical moment where black had to decide if he was going to play d5 or not, the majority of strong players that play this or played this, because of course now every strong player plays the Marshall or the Berlin, the majority of strong players that played this played the move pawn to d5. And then white needs to reply with e5, and then this knight plants itself on e4. Now white does immediately need to counter in the middle with knight to c3, and then black should make this move pawn to f5, which essentially forces white's next move. White has to take that pawn en passant. So after captures en passant, the main move here is knight to f6, and that should be the move that black should play. It is possible to play bishop captures f6, but apparently this is just major advantage white, and this did happen in Anand versus Adams, played in Linares back in 1994. White can play knight captures e4, d captures e4, rook captures e4, and after queen to d5, rook to g4, this was major advantage white, and Anand did go on to win. Anand versus Adams in Linares in 1994. So going back after e captures f6, knight captures f6 is the correct move. And now, back in the mid to late 90s, Nunn's Chess Openings was kind of the main book. That was the dictionary, so to speak, that everybody used for openings. It recommended a handful of different moves in this position, none of which were correct. And it didn't even mention the correct move, which is the move that according to theory is correct, the move that according to the engine is correct. That move is bishop to g5. So this is really the move that you should be playing, just developing your last piece, preparing to put something on the c file, just preparing to get your pieces to good solid squares. And so the game that I'm following here is actually Anand versus Nikolic, played in Monte Carlo back in 1999. which continued pawn to b4. Now at this point, Anand played the move knight to e2. I want to note that knight a4 is probably just a really simple improvement, and it's probably, if you're playing this with the white pieces, this is what you should be adding to your repertoire. On pawn to b4, knight a4 I think is more correct. The point being is after knight to e4, which is completely logical, putting the knight back on the e4 square now that it's not undermined with the knight on c3, we would have bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, rook e1, and then say knight g6, knight c5 should be major advantage white. Again, these weaknesses along the c file and a file, coupled with the fact that we have access to both open files for the rooks, this should be major advantage white. Actually, this is closer to decisive advantage white after knight to c5. So b4, knight e2, maybe not best, but Anand still ended up with a good game. After knight to e2, we had knight e4, and then Anand played bishop e3, which was slight edge white, and Anand did go on to win with the white pieces. And this was Anand versus Nikolic, Monte Carlo in 1999. But again, if you're building a repertoire and you want to play the correct thing with the white pieces, I would recommend instead bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, and then knight to g3. This is the engine recommendation. This is what Stockfish says you need to do. And then after knight takes g3, we would have fg3, knight f5, something like king h2, and on queen d6, knight e5 should be major advantage white, again for the same reasons as the last variation. We have two completely open files for the rooks. Black has these weaknesses along c5, c6, c7, and white should have some sort of advantage. So in conclusion, the Kholmov variation, beginning with the move bishop to e6, isn't something that you should be horribly worried about. White should have some sort of comfortable slight edge after d4. You do need to know a little bit of theory, not a whole lot. Basically, there's not a ton of deviations after you get through this main line of bishop b3, ab3. The majority of people play d5. e5 is sort of the main line, and the rest of it pretty much goes as stated in the video. These positions are anywhere from slight edge to major advantage white if you play the theory correctly, and it's not something that white should be horribly worried about, which is probably why people don't do this type of thing. They just play the Berlin or the Marshall in every single game, which if you do play the Ruy Lopez with the white pieces in modern chess, it's going to account for about 80 to 90% of your games. But on the off chance you play against somebody that does want to play one of these old main lines, and of course they're still very much playable, you will have to know the theory, and this will hopefully get you a good position with the white pieces from which you can play chess. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you found this information useful. I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.